Scrutiny of EU legislative proposals, Schedule B, COM 2018-688 and Join 2018-26 and 27. It's proposed that these proposals do not warrant further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Agreed. In today's meeting, we meet on Tánaiste with the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Deputy Simon Coveney, to discuss the latest developments in Brexit and matters that have arisen at Foreign Affairs Council and other matters relevant to foreign affairs and trade. Tánaiste, you are very welcome here today along with your officials. The format of the meeting is that we will hear your opening statement, Tánaiste, before going into a question and answer session with members of the committee. Before we begin, may I remind members, witnesses and those in the public gallery to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off completely for the duration of the meeting, as to cause interference even on silent mode with the recording equipment in this committee room. Also, I remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act of 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, where possible, they should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And I also welcome the members of the Diplomatic Corps who are with us here for today's meeting as well. And now call on Tánaiste to make his opening remarks. Tánaiste.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to be able to have a discussion with the committee members, and I look forward to your questions and comments. I'm going to make an initial statement, which is a reasonably lengthy statement, but it will give a good overview, I think, of some of the issues that we've been dealing with at the Foreign Affairs Council at the European level, which is what I was asked to do. And then, obviously, I'm in your hands, but I suspect there'll be demands for quite a detailed discussion on Brexit, which I'm happy to do. So I want to thank you for the invitation to address you this afternoon, and I'm keen to provide an update on the developments at the EU Foreign Affairs Council, which most recently met this Monday. In addition, I know the committee is interested in developments related to Brexit, given fast-moving events this week, and I look forward to a discussion on this and other matters. My department has provided a detailed information note for the committee on the wide range of issues that the Foreign Affairs Council has considered in the past few months. In the interests of maximising the time available for discussion, I propose to address the major themes of the Council discussions in my opening remarks. First of all, in relation to Jordan. As ever, developments in the Middle East feature prominently in discussions at the Council. I supported the addition of Jordan as a discussion item on the agenda in June. This took place just after I visited Jordan myself. My own view is that Jordan plays an essential role as a stabilising influence in a very difficult region, and I believed it was important for the EU to express and show in a concrete way our support. Jordan has long hosted large refugee populations of Palestinian refugees, refugees from Iraq after 2003, and now hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees on top of that. This places a huge strain on the Jordanian economy, and US cuts to UNRWA funding have made the situation even more difficult. As Jordan is trying to introduce economic reforms under pressure from the IMF, I feel that it's important that the EU look at the trade access that Jordan has to the EU market and see how we could improve it. I'm also pleased that plans are proceeding for Ireland to establish a resident embassy in Jordan early next year. As regards Yemen, the gravity of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen simply can't be underestimated. The UN has warned that the country is on the brink of a major catastrophe. The need for a ceasefire is stark. At the June Council, EU ministers were briefed via video conference by UN Special Envoy Mr. Martin Griffiths on his framework for peace in Yemen. We agreed conclusions that reiterated that there can't be any military solution to the conflict and underlined our strong support for the UN Special Envoy and his efforts to bring about an inclusive political solution. In November, EU ministers reaffirmed our strong support for efforts to bring the parties back to the negotiating table. The situation in Yemen is incredibly shocking and distressing, and there has been little good news over the last 4.5 years. I was very glad to hear that peace talks restarted in Sweden last week, following intensive UN efforts and a number of confidence-building measures. Clearly, the problems in Yemen are very complex, but it is important to it's an important step that both sides have come to the table, and I think everybody wishes these efforts well in Sweden. The Council has also considered the death of Jamal Khashoggi. On behalf of the EU, the High Representative has called publicly for an independent and credible investigation, which Ireland fully supports and insists on. As I've said myself directly to the Ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Dublin, we must get the facts of this case and ensure that, that those responsible are held to account in full. Ireland also specifically raised the Khashoggi case during Saudi Arabia's Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council in November. On Libya, the situation in Libya was discussed at the FAC in July and October, and conclusions were adopted this week, reflecting the seriousness of the situation there and the importance it is accorded by the EU. During these meetings, my counterparts and I reiterated our united support for a Libyan-found solution to the political crisis under the auspices of the UN political process. We also underlined the importance of elections in completing Libya's transition, while recognising the need for the right conditions to be in place for free and fair elections, which is challenging. Libya and Syria also featured in the October Council discussion on the external aspects of migration with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, and the Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Antonio Vittorini. On the issue of migration, Ireland wants to find a consensus based on a balance of responsibility and solidarity. We fully support efforts to tackle root causes and are supportive of the UN Global Pact on Migration, which unfortunately has become controversial in some parts of the world, which represents, in our view, a balanced approach for cooperation between countries and regions with very different perspectives on and experiences of migration. On Iran, my colleagues and I discussed the situation in Iran in November and again at the FAC on Monday. We discussed the implications of the reimposition of US sanctions in November and reconfirmed our support for the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. Our objectives are to support the continued implementation of this agreement, which has been successful and continues to deliver, and to support EU business in continuing to trade with Iran to the benefit of both sides. However, we also expressed our concerns about Iran's recent ballistic missile tests, as well as the destabilising role which Iran plays in many countries across the region. The EU believes that we must face these issues head-on and deal with them. However, we believe that keeping faith with the agreement we have already reached on nuclear issues is an important first step in bringing Iran back into the international fold, as hopefully, eventually, as a responsible and constructive partner. These are challenging issues, and I expect we will return to them many times in the future. But there is a high degree of unity amongst member states on what we're trying to do. On EU-Africa relations, on Monday the FAC discussed preparations for the upcoming EU-African Union ministerial meeting in January. This will be the first annual joint ministerial meeting since the AU-EU summit in Abidjan last November. We agreed that the meeting agenda will be developed around three themes: peace, security and governance, secondly, investment, trade and skills, and thirdly, multilateralism. Ireland remains committed to supporting countries in Africa in meeting the challenges they face, both bilaterally and through our membership of the EU. We must continue to strengthen cooperation between the African Union and the EU, including on trade as well as development. The proposal for an Africa-Europe alliance for sustainable investment and jobs sets out a comprehensive economic agenda with job creation at its core. The FAC also discussed developments in Africa more generally, including in the Horn of Africa and Red Sea in June, and in the Central African Republic in October. And I'll have an opportunity to be at an EU-Africa summit next week on Tuesday in Vienna. On Ukraine, in November and December, the Council discussed Ukraine. On Monday, ministers expressed deep concern about the tensions in the Sea of Azov. The EU expects Russia to ensure unhindered and free passage through the Kerch Strait to and from the Azov Sea, in accordance with international law. Ministers met with Ukrainian Foreign Minister and reaffirmed the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. In November, ministers condemned the so-called elections in the separatist Donbas region of Ukraine on the 11th of November as running contrary to the letter and spirit of the Minsk agreements. Ministers also welcomed progress on reforms in Ukraine, while noting that much more still needs to be done. On the Western Balkans, Eastern Partnership and Central Asia, the Council has also discussed developments in the countries of the Western Balkans, Eastern Partnership and Central Asia. Ministerial meetings with the Eastern Partnership and Central Asian countries took place in October and November. On Monday, the Council had a wide range of discussions on the Western Balkans, touching on progress in 2018 and expectations for 2019. On Venezuela, which is an unfolding and very difficult situation. In October and again on Monday, ministers discussed the situation in Venezuela, which appears to be worsening. There is an acute humanitarian crisis with the potential for regional instability due to the strain being put on neighbouring countries by mass migration. Ministers agreed to explore the idea of establishing an international contact group to bring together the EU and other actors with influence on both sides in Venezuela to facilitate a negotiation. It is expected that a decision on this will be made in the January Foreign Affairs Council. Ministers also discussed EU reaction to the upcoming inauguration of President Maduro on the 10th of January, following elections that were clearly neither free or fair nor credible. In terms of the EU global strategy and implementation, the Council has also been discussing how the EU can promote a rules-based international order with multilateralism as its key principle and the United Nations at its heart. This is very much in line with Ireland's vision, which I articulated at the UN General Assembly in September. The UN Global Strategy commits the UN to promote peace, prosperity, democracy, human rights and, of course, the rule of law. The Council also continued to monitor progress on the implementation of the strategy. This includes strengthening the EU's peacekeeping capacity in support of the United Nations. We've also made progress on implementing a strategy approach to strengthening the resilience of states and societies in our neighbourhood and developing an integrated approach to conflicts and crises. Unfortunately, there are far too many of them in our neighbourhood right now. On CSDP issues, the Council discussed security and defence issues in the context of the EU Global Strategy in November. Ministers adopted a new civilian CSDP compact that will make civilian CSDP more capable, flexible and responsive, and will strengthen the EU's external engagement in the rule of law, policing and civil administration. It will also enhance the capacity of the EU to respond to new and emerging challenges in our neighbourhood. Ireland was a leading promoter of the compact. On EU-UN peacekeeping operations, Ireland supports ongoing cooperation between the EU and UN on peacekeeping operations and crisis management. We were pleased that the EU endorsed and updated shared priorities of the UN-EU partnership on peace operations and crisis management in September. The Council also welcomed an Irish paper introduced by my colleague Minister Keogh on how EU member states can better cooperate under the auspices of the EU in support of UN peacekeeping operations more generally. On Brexit, Chair, I don't propose to give a long dissertation on Brexit in terms of reading out a response, but let me just say this. We have essentially our approach on Brexit now is to is to prepare for all eventualities, but to obviously continue to try to influence what we can, where we can, to maximise the chances of the deal that was negotiated over nearly a 2-year period to hold and to take effect. We have now a withdrawal agreement that is a compromise on both sides. The EU has had to compromise, the UK has had to compromise, but the core Irish interests and vulnerabilities have been responded to in that withdrawal agreement in as effective a way as I think could have happened. The Good Friday Agreement is protected, the Common Travel Area is protected, the guarantees that were given politically this time last year have been followed through on and delivered in a legal text to ensure that people do not have to worry about future border infrastructure re-emerging between our two jurisdictions. And other issues in the withdrawal agreement from citizens' rights more generally, the 3.5 million or so EU citizens living in the UK and the 1.5 million or so UK citizens living around the EU would have certainty. The financial settlement issue in terms of the UK's contribution to EU budgets up until the end of 2020 is largely settled. And of course, perhaps most importantly for businesses, there is the facilitation in the legal text of a transition period for an initial 21 months until the end of 2020, but then the option for the UK, if they want to take it, of extending that transition for a further 1 or 2 years, if that's necessary in order to finalise the negotiated agreement of the detail of a future relationship agreement between the UK and the EU. On the issues that have caused so much political controversy and debate in Westminster, in particular in relation to the backstop, I think it is important to say, the factual position here, rather than the case that has been made by some, is that the backstop doesn't represent a threat to anybody. The backstop is about preventing the threat to the normality and stability and peaceful relations that have built up over the last 2 decades on the island of Ireland, and ensuring that we don't have the corrosive impact in the future of enforced border infrastructure between the two jurisdictions. And I think some people in this room will know only too well why we have been so firm and clear across all political parties, I think, on this ask and the insistence that it be accommodated in a withdrawal agreement. In my view, there hasn't been enough focus on the context of the backstop. First of all, the only reason a conversation around the backstop began at all was because people wanted to protect the peace process and ensure that the kind of trade and movement of goods, services, people and capital on the island of Ireland that has reinforced good relations can sustain into the future. But I think it's also important to say that the backstop is a fallback, last resort insurance mechanism. Nobody wants to have to use it. And last December, what we agreed between the UK negotiating team and the EU negotiating team was that we would try to solve the border concerns on the island of Ireland through a future relationship agreement that would be comprehensive enough to do that. If that wasn't possible, the second option would be that the UK would offer bespoke solutions, recognising the unique challenges on the island of Ireland that the border presented, because let's not forget, it's not just a border between two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, but it is going to become a border between the United Kingdom and the EU. It is the EU's external border. But if it's not possible to get agreement on bespoke solutions, well then the default fallback position was that the UK would maintain full alignment with the rules of the customs union and single market in the areas necessary to protect North-South cooperation and an all-island economy and to protect the peace process. And many people seem to talk about the backstop now as if it is the basis of the future relationship, which it is not. we are all committed to ensuring that the backstop never takes effect. And should it take effect, we are committed to trying to ensure that it's only temporary, so that it can be replaced with something more permanent. But for the moment, in my view, there is not another credible fallback solution that can take the place of the backstop. And that is why EU leaders have been so clear, and the British Prime Minister has been so clear, that there is a need for the backstop, even though we want to avoid using it, and if it ever takes effect, we want to make sure that it's temporary and short-lived. But that temporary commitment has to be qualified, and it is qualified by the language in the withdrawal agreement, which says that it's there unless and until it's replaced by something else that can do the same job. But we all want to replace it. But I've said it so many times, I don't believe anybody on this island should feel threatened by the backstop. This is a worst case fallback position, and even in that case, Northern Ireland is effectively being offered free, uninhibited, seamless trade access into the EU single market and customs union, and into the rest of the United Kingdom's single market too. And it is a British red line that has resulted in the element of the backstop that is now referred to as the single customs territory, because Theresa May herself made it very clear that she would not accept any deal that put Northern Ireland in a different customs union to the rest of the United Kingdom. And so the response to the EU from some in Westminster, which says you're looking to trap us in your customs union with the backstop, I think misunderstands where this has come from. This was a British ask. The initial proposal from the EU side was that we would have a Northern Ireland specific backstop that wouldn't involve the rest of the United Kingdom, Britain at all, in the backstop. But it was on the back of a British request to actually make the backstop UK-wide on customs, which initially the EU said no to and then facilitated after a lot of very difficult negotiation. That now is the point of criticism for some in Westminster, which is really an irony that I think needs to be exposed. The final thing I want to say on the backstop is that I do want to commend the British Prime Minister for following through on the political commitments that were made last December, and for understanding the fragility and complexity of politics on this island, and the need for an insurance mechanism that can lay the fears and address the fears that many people have of seeing physical border infrastructure re-emerging on our island. And she has addressed that with the backstop. She now needs to get some accommodation from us in the context of the reassurance and clarification that she's asking for. She's not asking to change the withdrawal agreement. She's asking for a reassurance and clarification from the EU side that the backstop, that everything possible will be done to avoid the backstop ever being used, and therefore a focus on both sides to get a future relationship that's comprehensive enough to deal with the issue. And she also, I think, wants reassurance that if the backstop is ever triggered, in other words, if there's a time period at the end of a transition period, but before a future relationship has been signed off, that if there is a need to use a backstop, that we all work to ensure that it's only on a temporary basis, and that it gets replaced with something that can do the same job, but that is more permanent. There are other issues too, obviously related to Brexit, which I can go into. The final thing I'll mention, though, on Brexit is contingency, because while we will continue to negotiate politically to try to get acceptance and agreement to ratify the withdrawal agreement, which we believe to be the most sensible way to manage Brexit now, and also the agreement on the political declaration on the future relationship, which we also believe is balanced, that we don't know, in truth, whether or not the Parliament in Westminster will ratify that deal. We hope they will, but we don't know. And so we have to plan for all eventualities in terms of how we as a country collectively would respond to a no-deal Brexit. What we have, and we have spent many months, by the way, planning for this, our contingency planning in terms of public comment has primarily been around what we describe as the central case scenario, which we still regard as the most likely scenario, whereby there is a deal on a withdrawal agreement, there's a 2-year transition period, and at the end of that we would have to be prepared for the new realities in terms of a new trading environment that may involve a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK that would, in all likelihood, require some customs checks, some SPS checks, sanitary and phytosanitary checks from Department of Agriculture and Department of Health inspectors and so on. Clearly, if we have a no-deal Brexit that kicks in after the 29th of March, should that happen, a lot of those preparations need to be fast-tracked, and work is taking place now to do that. We made a government decision on Tuesday that essentially is resulting in an instruction to senior civil servants, secretaries general, basically in the government departments necessary to build on the plans that are already there to make sure that we can be ready by the 29th of March. And of course, there is also an increase in the intensification of preparation at an EU level collectively for contingency plans too, because in so many areas it is EU competence which will determine how contingency works, whether that's in aviation, whether it's in fishing, whether it's in data protection, whether it's in security, whether it's in recognition of certification and standards, whether it's in citizens' rights and movement, and so many other areas. As I said in the Dáil today, the Commission has been holding sectoral seminars with the 27 member states to talk about contingency planning in all of these areas and how the European institutions would likely respond and how they would expect countries to respond in a way that's consistent with that. And the last of those sectoral seminars will be on the 10th of January. So next week we will publish an update paper, if you like, on contingency. We have a Brexit stakeholders group which meets roughly every 5 to 6 weeks, and it's a broad cross-section, including political parties, of people who are following Brexit closely. And we'll bring that update contingency paper to that group and then we'll publish it afterwards. So people, I think, will have a clearer picture in terms of the areas where Ireland will be planning domestically ourselves, where we will be planning in partnership with other EU countries, and where we will be working with the EU institutions to put contingency plans in place. But let me be very clear. Contingency planning is not about simply maintaining the status quo after Britain leaves, after the UK leaves the European Union. Contingency planning will involve a lot of negativity in the context of a no-deal Brexit and a much more difficult trading environment, which we will have to manage and mitigate against the worst impacts of. A no-deal Brexit is difficult for everybody, particularly difficult for the UK, but it'll be difficult for us too. And we shouldn't pretend otherwise. That is why trying to get this deal across the line, which 28 countries, including the British government, have signed up to, is so important in January.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste, for your detailed presentation. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, and it was very useful to have the briefing note beforehand. I would just go to migration first, and I do think it has to be acknowledged that there is more migration within Africa than there is from Africa. And, we see the way in which countries in Africa with very, very challenging situations themselves are coping with migrants. And you just use one example of Jordan, but I think there are others. A couple of questions. One is around Libya, and how confident are you of a Libyan-found solution when there are so many factions there? Are the detention centres still open? Because they are a source of funding for certain groups within the Libyan framework. That's one on that one. As you know, there were a number of TDs. A number of us did go to Syria a couple of months ago. Private visit certainly opened our eyes to the reality of what's there. And, I would say there were atrocities on every side within that Syrian conflict. There's no good side or bad side. But I think the reality is that the majority of people still living there, they are trying to rebuild their lives. They're starting, and we saw so many examples of that resilience. And I think it is time that we looked at engaging in Syria with the people who are living there and trying to, to rebuild their country after the conflict. On Yemen, and it is good to see that the negotiations have started after a long lead-in period. And I just noticed in the briefing, the point is that there can't be a military solution, but yet where is the condemnation of the arms trade? Countries at the EU, like England and France, who are fueling that conflict, and yet you say there's not going to be a military solution to it. But yet, as long as the arms keep coming in, that's what's going to happen. We had an interesting meeting yesterday with the Iranian delegation, but I suppose one thing that came across for me is, the way in which the sanctions are affecting them. And I did ask them, because it's the US who's pulling the strings here, as they have been pulling them with Cuba for many years, and that the US can put fines on companies and banks because they are trading or trying to trade with countries that they don't like. And then I just go back briefly, I'll leave Brexit to the others, or I might come in again later. The leader's question this morning, I was disappointed that, I know we need aid, countries need aid, and we give it, and we're very generous and we do it right. But giving more aid is the short-term answer. We're not looking at the long-term answer. Which is the other bits and pieces, the policy coherence, and we'll see what comes in the white paper. But there has been additional funding, I think 110 million. Have you earmarked where that's going? Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy O'Sullivan. On Taoiseach, Chair.
Yeah, let me kind of do it in reverse. First of all, on the aid, you'll see our new aid paper, and I'm kind of slow to call it aid because it's really about development, and it's about partnership. I speak a lot about the relationship between the EU and Africa, which in my view, in terms of political infrastructure, is totally inadequate. We need a partnership with Africa and Europe in the future, which is based much more on cooperation and equal input than simply funding and aid. A lot of aid is linked to contracts, and it's tied. I'm glad to say Ireland is not part of that approach. So I think you will see in the new aid strategy trying to link development and capacity building, whereby the private sector can very much complement and add significantly to some of the platforms that we're trying to create through aid programs around stability, and building local capacity and so on. And I think, hopefully I've shown a record in doing that kind of thing before in terms of the Africa agri-food support program that we've done previously in partnership between my previous Department of Agriculture and the Department of Foreign Affairs, and that's the kind of thing that I think we need to do a lot more of. I hope you'll see a new approach that you'll welcome when you see that document in mid-January. On Yemen, just to say, I have agreed to a motion in the Senate on Yemen, which will be debated next Tuesday. That does involve a condemnation of arms exports to Saudi Arabia in the context of the war in Yemen, although we're all hopeful that the ceasefire and the talks process can ensure that ceasefire is lasting. I think it's important that we're realistic. It is virtually impossible to get a united EU position on arms trade. We do have arms trade treaties that member states are bound by, or should be bound by, in terms of the responsibility of countries to, if they're exporting arms, to know where they're going, what they're being used for. A number of EU countries that do actually export quite a lot of arms, historically, like Sweden and Austria, for example, no longer are selling arms to countries that are actively at war, including Saudi. Ireland is quite vocal in this space. and you know, we've supported a motion that I believe to be balanced, but also quite direct. That is, I suspect, will be agreed virtually unanimously in the Seanad on Tuesday. On Syria, yeah, I mean, I've just got a note on Syria here, so I better read it. There's a new reality emerging. So far, few refugees are returning due to fear of savage repression, fears that prompted the start of the conflict back in 2011. And I think we are going to continue to have to provide significant humanitarian aid, not only to Syrian refugees in Syria, but also to Syrian refugees outside of Syria. I think there's a real fear of reprisals and the settling of scores. And so I think some refugees are welcome home, but others aren't, depending on what side they were on in the civil war there. So I think we need to not be naive about what's possible in Syria in terms of time frame and so on. But we have to be aware of the need to try to facilitate the safe return of Syrian refugees to their home country. And not only because of the difficult burden that many refugees are on neighbouring countries, but also because people have a right to return. But I think we're some way off seeing the opportunity for safe return for many refugees, given the approach of the Assad regime. And I think oversight will be essential when that return happens. But I also think there's going to need to be a global effort to help rebuild the country, quite frankly, and that's the same for Yemen. But I mean, both Yemen and Saudi Arabia, both Yemen and Syria are countries that, you know, are going to require many billions of euros and dollars to rebuild, and societies will need to be rebuilt as well as physical structures. On Libya, regrettably, political fragmentation and the fragile security situation in Libya is really only allowing for a limited capacity for the international community to end abuses there. And I don't think anybody should pretend that some of the camps that pretty horrible imagery has emerged from are all gone away. I think there has been significant efforts to try to build capacity amongst systems in Syria to try to protect people, but we're clearly not where we need to be. But there is a need to try to build consensus between groups and factions in Syria in order to be able to try provide a platform and a foundation for free and fair elections. And I think the UN process is the one that we all need to follow now. That part of the problem in Syria is that there were different organisations trying to do different things for a while. And I think they have now all coalesced behind the UN efforts, which is necessary and positive. But I wouldn't want to be overly positive about where we are. I still think it's still a haven for human trafficking and for a very sophisticated and very well-funded level of illegal activity, and sending families in boats that have no capacity to get very far to sea, and so on. There have been some successful efforts which the EU has funded to repatriate people back to home countries or source countries from Libya, and I think you'll see a lot more of that in the future, and it's been quite successful and has actually reduced numbers quite significantly. But there's still an awful lot of work to do. It's very hard to get certainty in terms of cooperation with a state when you don't have a sound structure to negotiate with politically. I mean, and I take your points on migration, and I'm glad to say that Minister Charlie Flanagan has signed on behalf of Ireland the UN's Global Compact on Migration, which is a voluntary commitment. Unfortunately, many EU countries decided not to do that, but a majority did. And I think it just reflects how deeply divisive the political debate globally on migration still is. And I think we see those tensions in the Mediterranean now, even with even when you have NGO boats that are no longer allowed to operate in the Med. I think it's a reflection of some of the challenges that the EU faces in the future, and even the challenges that an operation like Sophia faces in the future is pretty sobering, and it's something that Ireland will continue to try and make an input into. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Taoiseach. Deputy Niall Collins.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Taoiseach. You're welcome, and your team is welcome. Just a couple of questions. I'll just throw them all out to you, and maybe the comments or replies. I've raised most of them with you before. Could I get an update from you in relation to the Middle East peace process? You had mentioned previously that you were anxious to convene some type of a summit or a meeting in Dublin in the new year. Secondly, could I get your view or a comment from you in relation to two areas, and Deputy O'Sullivan has touched on one of them, in relation to Iran and the, I suppose, the climate of human rights there. I think it was kind of news to us yesterday in relation to the death penalty, at least. They tell us that it has been legislated out of practice, and also in relation to stonings, people who have been subjected to stoning to death. As late as this morning, we met a group who were involved in democracy and human rights, advocating for democracy and human rights in Bahrain, and they painted a pretty grim picture for us in relation to, I suppose, what could be classified as political prisoners. There seems to be a complete lack of open, transparent democracy, complete lack of freedom of speech. People are locked up, tried and sentenced to death for speaking out, even on Twitter. We were told there's, I think, approximately 40 people presently sentenced to death. Could I get an update or a comment from you in relation to, I suppose, what we could describe as the chilling effect of the whole situation emanating from Hungary and the rise of Viktor Orban? Raised this with you previously also, and its impact on, again, open democracy, how the media are being impacted, the judiciary. Could I get an update from you? And some of us had the benefit of a briefing last week from Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason in relation to the campaign for the Security Council seat in the United Nations. Finally, just two items. Just a comment from you in relation to the undocumented Irish in the States. We're aware of the, we're up to speed, I suppose, with the campaign in relation to the E3 visas, but I suppose there's still the lingering concern in relation to how ultimately we can seek to address the cohort of Irish who are undocumented within the United States. And just finally, in relation to Brexit, because we're eating, sleeping and drinking Brexit every day of the week, as we know, could you just give us a little bit more detail in relation to the work which is underway, which you've referred to in relation to preparedness, and the recruitment campaign, which I think is at Revenue are conducting in terms of customs staff in particular, and the number, there's different numbers have been quoted in terms of how many are actually being sought through the present recruitment campaign, and could you give us just some bit of an indication as to where the critical mass of these people are going to be dotted along the border? Are they going to be in our ports? Are they going to be everywhere? Where are they going to be? Or I know we haven't been saying publicly a whole pile in terms of the contingency planning, in terms of the detail, but can you give us any little insight into it? Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy Collins. On Tánaiste, some of the matters Deputy Collins referred to would be outside of the Foreign Affairs Council, so if you wish to comment on
Yeah,
some
no,
of
look,
those,
I mean,
please.
a lot of questions there, but they're all very valid. First of all, on the Middle East peace process, which we've spoken a lot about it, spoken to Deputy Crowe about that as well, obviously, and I mean, first of all, look, in terms of the positive contributions that Ireland is making, I mean, last week in the UN, Ambassador Bern Nason did a phenomenal job, is the only way I can describe it, in terms of ensuring that Ireland was not only relevant but actually pivotal in getting a resolution agreed at the UN General Assembly, which got the support of 156 countries. Only 6 countries opposed and a small number abstained. And it was an Irish resolution on the Middle East, insisting on a two-state solution, referring to previous UN resolutions, which recognised the unacceptability of settlements, settlement expansion, and so on, and the need for a fair and lasting peace process. We remain very active at international fora on the Middle East peace process, and I think my record at UN Foreign Affairs Council meetings, at EU Foreign Affairs Council meetings and at the UN is pretty strong on that. We do plan to have, as I said before, Deputy, a meeting in Dublin early next year. It's not possible to do it in January, so we're hoping to be able to do it in February. It's purely a scheduling reason. We do need to get key countries here, and the most important of those we need to get certainty from in terms of attending on certain dates, and as you'd expect, these are busy people. So, but I'm hopeful we'll be able to get an agreed date in February, and we'll have a number of key EU countries and a number of key Arab countries here to discuss in a private discussion. It's a retreat-style structure, which is what we want, which we think will work well, and we've consulted widely on that to try to get some new thinking into the Middle East peace process, which obviously would involve the Palestinian Authority. On Iran, while the human rights situation in Iran is a matter for concern, Iranians do not enjoy freedom of religion and belief, of expression or assembly. There are particular concerns about the treatment of religious and ethnic minorities, political activists, journalists and bloggers, and human rights defenders. Women are also of an issue of real concern. So while we have taken and support the EU perspective in relation to the nuclear agreement, that in our view is hugely important to prevent the development of nuclear weapons, that doesn't mean that we are not critical, and I would hope consistent, in terms of the human rights record in Iran. In relation to Bahrain, I remain very concerned about the human rights situation in Bahrain. The Bahraini government has repeatedly stated its commitment to improving its human rights record, and human rights are enshrined in the Bahraini constitution. Fulfilling this commitment must include allowing space for Bahrainis to express disagreement with or criticism of the government without fear of arrest or mistreatment. You know, I'm often confronted with these issues in different parts of the world where politicians, you know, ask me with sort of seriousness and respect, how do we fund NGOs that are critical of our own government? How do we justify doing that? And sometimes, how do we fund NGOs that are critical of other governments that are supposed to be allies that we trade with and work with? And the truth is that, you know, in any functioning normal democracy, you know, constructive and transparent criticism through active, mobilised civil society is a good thing, not a bad thing. And governments shouldn't see it as a threat, unless, of course, that activism crosses lines into violence and instability. You know, I think Ireland has and continues to be very consistent on that, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's the Far East. In relation to Hungary, let me say that we do have concerns over the civic space available for NGOs to continue to operate in Hungary. In some ways, it's pretty shocking that you have to say that about an EU member state, but I think it's the truth. These concerns have been exacerbated by the passage of legislation by the Hungarian Parliament aimed at individuals and organisations providing lawful assistance to migrants and asylum seekers. We also have concerns about the position of the Central European University and the difficulties that they've been having. Not a good development, I would say. Having said that, my party share a place in the European People's Party with the governing party in Hungary. Debates around these issues do take place in that forum, as they should, because there is a real concern about some of the politics and the direction of policy in terms of the Hungarian government. On our SECO campaign, I think we're in reasonably good shape. We're certainly very focused on it. Ambassador Bernason and her team in New York are really active. We have focused on strengthening relations with traditional friends, particularly across Africa, where Ireland has a very active development programme for many, many years, but also building new alliances and friendships across, for example, island states in the Caribbean, who are now discussing with us, you know, how you build resilience in terms of climate adaptation. We're going to hold a small island states conference in Ireland next summer, specifically focusing on how you build blue economies sustainably and how you respond to, in the context of climate resilience, where islands are literally facing hurricanes of increasing strength year after year, and in some cases rising sea levels, particularly in the Pacific. So really interesting new discussions and partnerships are starting to take place there, and I think Irish technology and know-how can be really helpful, actually, in some of these islands. We have, as well, very good relationships across the Middle East in terms of our interest in, and I hope our balanced input in the Middle East peace process, insisting that a two-state solution must be kept alive, even though many people write it off already, and also insisting that any peace process has to happen on the basis of parity of esteem between both sides, and the obligations that an occupying force, an occupied territory, have under international law are followed. And sometimes I'm accused of being partisan and anti-Israeli. I am neither. But I do call things as I see them, as I think the government does, in terms of international law, of agreements that have been agreed at UN level, and our hopes and demands around a fair and equitable peace process that can work for both sides, that understands that Israel have very genuine security concerns, but also understands that Palestinians need to be treated fairly in their hopes and dreams for a country of their own. So I think our SECO campaign, while it's going to be really competitive, because unfortunately we're competing with two other countries that are also very active on the global stage. You know, you couldn't pick two tougher competitors than Norway and Canada, actually. Only two get chosen from the three. And this is a vote that's going to take place in about 18 months' time. But I think we are working hard and we're well placed, and we've shown before that we can win a place on the UN Security Council, even when there's very stiff competition. On the E3 visas, and on the undocumented, I'm hoping in the next 24 hours we might get a breakthrough here. But I think we need to be careful not to predict things too firmly, because you never quite know what happens in the US Senate. But we've worked hard. Deputy John Deasy in particular has worked very hard, and our embassy and our staff and our team in Washington have really done a great job here. And I hope that that's recognised if and when we get this across the line with the support of friends of Ireland in both Congress and in the US Senate who want to facilitate a structured, sensible facilitation of Irish people who want to get visas to go and work and live in the States. The way this is proposed will work is that Australia is the only country that has this facilitation for E3 visas. They get the allocation of 10,500 visas a year for predominantly young Australians to come and work legally in the US. That was a special facilitation after Australian contributions to assist the US militarily, and so what has transpired since is that in recent years only about half of those visas are used, and so there's a surplus that are unused. And of course, we wanted to and have reassured Australia that we're not looking to try to take their visas. We only want to be facilitated with the visas that they don't use, that could potentially be applied to Irish people who want to travel to the US. And to really firm up that point and to reassure Australia that this isn't in any way undermining their scheme, the proposal is now that the surplus would be allocated to Ireland in the following year, so that in case Aussies felt that they're that they're missing out in any way, that's not the case. So whatever unused surplus in 2018 is there would be allocated in 2019 and so on. That's my understanding of the proposal now, to give the reassurance to Australia that this isn't Ireland trying to in any way undermine the allocation to Australians. So we've got a lot of support on this. People like Congressman Richie Neal, who was a sponsor of this legislation when it was in the House, and now senators who have been very helpful, are looking to facilitate this, and it could happen as soon as I say, in the next 24 hours. This could be approved by the Senate. It has to be unanimously approved by the Senate. So one senator could prevent it moving ahead, and so we've worked hard to address the concerns of a small number of senators, and we're, I hope, nearly there. In relation to, but that is very much about putting a visa system in place for new generations of Irish people, and this is really important. For many, many decades, through various different mechanisms, young Irish people have travelled to the US for work, for adventure, but to be part of the new America. And for me, it's hugely important that new generations of Irish people have that opportunity too. And that is why this E3 visa proposal is and legislation is so important. We have offered facilitation for US nationals that want to come to Ireland too, by the way, in return for this facilitation. And but what we've committed to, I don't think any Irish people would have any problems with. On the undocumented, the government has not lost sight of the pursuit of relief for undocumented Irish citizens in the US. The government, including my department, work with our envoy to the US Congress on the undocumented, Deputy John Deasy, and we'll continue to pursue the goal of trying to provide certainty and relief and safety for the many undocumented that work and live in the US, and many of them are part of Irish immigration centres, which we support and fund to help look after them. We had initially hoped that we could get legislation that would also provide a pathway to citizenship for many of the undocumented. And I think the E3 visa is a slightly different vehicle. But we will look for opportunities to try to focus on the challenges that undocumented Irish in the US continue to have. And I am well aware of the concerns and the vulnerabilities that they feel at the moment. Finally, on Brexit, yeah, no, just on the numbers, because there is a bit of confusion there. I mean, we started our contingency preparations on the basis of what I've described as this central case scenario. And basically, when you're preparing for anything, the place to start is the most likely outcome. And that is, you know, to get a deal, to have a withdrawal agreement in place, to have a transition, and then at the end of a transition to have an FTA-style agreement that will involve some border checks. But hopefully they will be limited. We agreed as a government back in July to take on 1,077 extra inspectors and staff in our ports and airports, primarily Dublin Port, Rossall Airport and Dublin Airport, which is where the vast majority of commercial goods traffic enters the Irish economy. In fact, half of the product going to Northern Ireland from Britain comes through Dublin as well. What the central case scenario would involve about 200 customs officials being taken on by the middle of next year. Clearly, in a no-deal scenario, the full 1,000 or so people that we need in our ports and airports would need to be taken on a lot quicker. And so it would involve in and around 600 customs officials. The other 400 then is broken up between sanitary and phytosanitary inspectors from the Department of Agriculture and food health inspectors from the Department of Health. And so there are recruitment campaigns either underway or being prepared in the Department of Health and the Department of Agriculture for those inspectors. And Customs have already moved ahead with their recruitment process and are in the process of initially recruiting 200, but there was a panel of 3,000 people applied for those customs jobs. So that panel of 3,000 people will allow us to increase the number of customs officials that we take on if we need to do that in a no-deal scenario quite quickly. But we'll provide a lot more detail around those numbers when we publish a paper to give people a sort of an update on where we're at on contingency planning at this stage for either a central case scenario but also for a no-deal scenario. We don't have all the answers yet because a lot of it is still being discussed at an EU level and is part of EU competence. But don't forget, the EU has already published about 70 papers on no-deal Brexit planning. So there's been quite a lot of work that's gone on in this space, but it'll need to continue and it'll need to intensify to make sure that we are in a place where we need to be by the 29th of March to try to mitigate against the downside of, and there undoubtedly would be many downsides of a no-deal Brexit should it happen.
Thanks, Taoiseach. Deputy Sean Crowe.
Good afternoon, Minister. I think you're right when you're saying that, I think we need to be seen as critical, fair and consistent. But again, when you read some of these statements that come from the, following these meetings, people would be people would be somewhat surprised with some of the stuff. Like you were saying about, Venezuela, the elections there neither free or fair. But then, there's been no mention of the elections in Bahrain, for instance, the 24th of November. And as you said yourself, there's a huge question marks in relation to Bahrain. No opposition candidate allowed to run in the election. No one allowed stand. People are being jailed for tweeting against a motor race. Regardless of tweeting against the regime, and that's the type of country you're dealing with. Also in relation to it talks about the destabilising influence of Iran, and again I suppose if you're someone living in Iran or Iraq or even parts of Syria, you would probably see, well, it's been a stabilising influence in the sense that they were the ones that help to stand up to ISIS in that part of the world. But again, that's all debatable in relation to that type of thing. But they have played positive roles in some cases in relation to around that part of the world. You talked in terms of the blocking statute that was devised some years ago to counter US sanctions in Cuba, but never actually operated. Maybe you just, maybe not today, but maybe you could expand on, how that will work. Some of us who were active in relation to the Cuban support group and against the sanctions and so on, they're finding it difficulty in relation to banks and that dealing with bank transfers and basic things like that. And I just wonder how this would roll out in relation to, the impact it would have on groups like that in Ireland. A lot of the other people have come up with in relation to, some of the issues, but I want to go back to the UN Migration Compact, and I suppose, like me, you've received emails and letters regarding the UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration that was signed this week in Marrakesh. I don't know about other members, but I'm somewhat astonished by some of the lies and misinformation that's being spread about this non-binding compact. If you go on to social media, it's absolutely appalling, some of the stuff that they talk in terms of this flood of migrants into Europe, this influx, and it's all coming from a handful of right-wing organisations and country. And I welcome that they recognise that migration is a global phenomenon and needs a global framework to deal with some of the challenges that it can create, but also recognise the huge positives that migrants can actually bring to countries. Does Ireland signing up to this mean that there's going to be thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and 20,000s of migrants coming to Ireland? I think I think that needs to be explained to people, but I think it's also important that that these lies are and this hysteria that's being spread and fear about the contact. I think it's important that those of us who understand what's going on, and particularly the government spokesperson, counteract and explain the reality and positivity of the compact. And I think that would be shared by most parties in there. But again, people can get carried away by a handful of letters or a couple of phone calls, and people, some people are scared in relation to that. I want to just focus in on Brexit. It's hardly being touched on, but I don't think anyone can deny it's been a bit of a shambles of a week in Westminster. We know that Theresa May now is still in place for now, but I don't think anyone can, know what's going to happen next. You explained clearly, in relation to the backstop and the importance of that, and I suppose it's again just ask you, in no uncertain terms, maybe to explain that the backstop itself is non-negotiable. And I think it's been, there's been positive statements in relation to, Brexit coming from the EU and our EU partner countries in relation to it. And people are talking in terms of, the importance of no hard border, the importance that, there be no diminution of people's rights. And I suppose it's in relation to that, Taoiseach, to maybe just focus in on that. Some of us would have travelled up to Belfast and Derry 2 weeks ago when we met with groups there, and I suppose the concern is that around this diminution of rights, people are concerned of what's coming down the track. We met with people from an educational background, and they're concerned about that whole area, the access to Erasmus. People were concerned about the EU health insurance card and the EU student fee rate, and those whole elements. And I just wonder, while it's welcome the statements from our European partners in relation to that, is there now a need to put some flesh on those statements. And what's your sense of, what's coming down the track? Yesterday in here, there would have been some of the partnerships. We met with one of the partnerships in Derry, the Northwest Partnership, and they talked about, that structure that's working. We met with the IBAN, the Central Region and the Eastern Partnership there yesterday. And again, they were talking in terms of structures that are actually working. They talked in terms of the Northwest, talked in terms of the A5 and the need for that, and how that would open up the whole economic development in that region. People from Manufactured Ireland were talking in terms of the difficulty in the mid central area of Monaghan, Fermanagh, and that whole area there, and the importance of that. So I suppose it's putting flesh on many of them proposals. One of the simplest things was proposed was the development of a port there in relation to Donegal. And again, small money, but huge impact on the whole region there. So it's about those forward-looking proposals. How can they be actioned? How are we going to put demands on our EU colleagues in relation to that, to build on the peace, to build on their statements about no hard borders? And I suppose part of that would be developing the economy in those regions and the importance of that and the trade itself. But I suppose the most important thing is about the rights of people. And that's what people keep coming back for, the right, access to the Court of Human Rights. How will that be impacted on citizens living in the North? And particularly in relation to where the original statement talked in terms of those residing in the North. And again, there's no, mention of that now. How do we reinforce those rights? And not just the Good Friday Agreement, but also the potential of the agreement itself. And I think that's where, we need to be talking up the Irish peace process. It's not just what we've achieved in the past, but what we can achieve in the future. And again, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. I can get into, discussions in relation to, a hard Brexit and so on. That's been, talked about in the chamber. We would believe that, there's a hard Brexit, that this whole area of a border poll, that's, again, it's a unity by consent, that's all part of the Good Friday Agreement. I know the Irish government have a different view in relation to that. But I think we also need to be talking in terms of the possibility of a hard Brexit and the implication that will have. I know what you're going to say is that, you believe that there's a possibility of this getting through. The numbers at the moment don't stack up in relation to that, but again, we're hopeful that can happen. But I'm concerned about, that whole region, that border region, and what we can do as in this jurisdiction in relation to supporting and building on the peace itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Cohen Thomas, Chair.
Yeah, a lot of questions there, and I am concerned in relation to Bahrain. I think I outlined that earlier, I mean, the truth is that there are so many things happening in so many parts of the world, you can't focus on all of them at the same time. But I think I gave you a sense of some of the priority areas and countries and challenges that we've been trying to deal with at the Foreign Affairs Council at an EU level. In terms of of Iran, sorry, now I have so many notes in front of me. Yeah, no, just on the nuclear deal itself. We were, as I've been quoted many times, as other EU leaders have too, very disappointed by the US decision to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. My EU colleagues and I discussed Iran and the JCPOA at the FAC in November and again earlier this week, and we reiterated our united and continued support for the full implementation of the agreement, including the creation of a special purpose vehicle that can effectively allow for investment and money flows back and forth. in the context of the US sanctions being implemented, which is not easy, because the US financial system really is the core of much of the of global commerce. In terms of the Global Compact, I'm glad you raised that issue, because I think there's a lot of scaremongering going on here. I've had people come up to me in the street and say it to me, which is unusual in Ireland, because generally we've avoided what I regard as the politics of migration here, partly because of where we are geographically on the globe, but also because we don't tend to have a sort of a hard right and hard left in Irish politics in large numbers from a policy perspective. So Ireland is supportive of the Global Compact for Migration adopted at the UN conference in Morocco in the last few days. We look forward to joining with other signatories in ensuring that migration can be safer, more orderly and better managed. It's regrettable that some countries have indicated that they will not join the Compact, and we hope that they'll reconsider this view in time. The lessons we've learned in the European Union during the 2015 migration crisis should serve to remind us of the need to address migration in a cooperative and comprehensive manner. The Global Compact is non-binding and in no way infringes upon states' sovereignty, and suggestions that it might lead to a surge in migration, in our view, are absolutely unfounded. Migration is a global challenge, whether we like it or not, and we need collective solutions based on multilateral agreements and structures, primarily through the UN and the EU also.
Excuse me, Taoiseach, there's a vote in the Dáil.
Oh God! All right. All right.
We might be able to wrap up fairly quickly when we come back.
Yeah.
Would that be okay?
I can come back if you want.
Yeah, if you can, for
No
a few
problem,
minutes.
Yeah.
Deputy McDonald and myself just want to make.
Yeah, I mean, I'd
very
like
quick
to
comment.
respond to some of Sean's questions on Brexit.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay.
And we suspend now until after the vote. Taoiseach, I think you said you had one question to answer to Deputy Crowe, was it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, just on the before we finish on the Global Compact, I know we're moving on to Brexit. I mean, I do want to. Was speaking to Deputy Crowe briefly as we walked over for the vote. I mean, a lot of people seem to have the wrong impression of this Global Compact, and that somehow this is seen as countries that want an open door policy on migration. I mean, it's nothing of the sort. This is about trying to balance rights and responsibilities to make sure that countries respond in a way that's consistent with international humanitarian law, that provides for a recognition of the reality of the extent of migration in different parts of the world, and the need to try to collectively respond in a way that's consistent, that allows countries to manage their own borders appropriately, but at the same time ensures that that collectively we can respond to the humanitarian challenge of significant levels of migration, which aren't going to reduce anytime soon, that's for sure. You know, we're talking about millions of people on the move within the continent of Africa at any given time. Unfortunately, huge numbers of people continuing to flee conflict and repression. And of course, very, very large numbers of people in refugee camps too, unfortunately in the millions. So migration is a reality that the international community needs to respond to with a lot more consistency than has been the case to date, where some countries take hardline positions and shut borders, and other countries then have to take a totally disproportionate burden in terms of the humanitarian challenges around mass migration. And that isn't sustainable. You know, and that's what this Global Compact is essentially trying to respond to, and that's why I'm glad to say the majority of UN member states supported it. But there's a lot of work to do, because there's some very influential countries and some very wealthy countries who have decided not to. On Brexit, Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the backstop is now part of a negotiated agreement that's not going to change. The British Prime Minister gave a very strong defence of the backstop on Monday when she spoke in the House of Commons under very difficult political circumstances. She recognised that the House of Commons needed reassurance and clarification around the backstop from the EU, and I hope we'll be able to give her that. But she also recognised the need for the backstop in the context of providing certainty and reassurance to people on the island of Ireland that they're not going to face border infrastructure as an unintended consequence of Brexit. And so, you know, I think I spoke earlier as to why the backstop is so important, but it's in terms of the backstop being present in any withdrawal agreement, that I think that isn't negotiable, quite frankly. Reading some of the British media today, there seems to be confirmation also that even if there was another future relationship agreement in place, which I think is unlikely to be, there'd still be a backstop required in the context of a withdrawal agreement, which creates the space, of course, through transition for the future relationship to be negotiated and finalised. But all the focus around the backstop, I think, has in many ways, you know, camouflaged or hidden an awful lot of the other very positive elements in the withdrawal agreement, which are following through on the very strong language of this time last year in the political declaration around the commitment by the UK of no diminution of rights for citizens in Northern Ireland. And I mean, essentially, that is something that we will have to get further detail on in any future relationship agreement. But, you know, citizens in Northern Ireland, because they have a right to Irish citizenship, will also have a right to EU citizenship. And therefore they will be able to move around and study and work across the European Union as other EU citizens can. There is a difference, though, between EU citizenship and EU residency rights and entitlements. I think it's important to say that that distinction is there. But certainly, I think it is the intention of the British government to try to ensure that the Erasmus programmes that are there would be made available to all British citizens in the future through an agreement with the EU on that basis. And certainly the EU health card and health insurance is also something that I think there will be a positive negotiation on in the future to ensure that citizens in Northern Ireland and indeed British citizens generally may well be able to benefit from that scheme. But of course they'll have to pay and contribute towards that because there's a cost to it, as a country, that is. In terms of investment in the northwest of the country generally, or in the border counties, I mean, which is in some ways a separate thing to Brexit, but it's linked. You know, I think we are, you know, if you look at the 20-year plan for Ireland 2040, there's a big emphasis actually on the northwest and on the border counties in terms of investment in road infrastructure, but also in connectivity north-south, north and south. So, you know, high-speed rail networks between Belfast and Dublin, for example, are very much part of that 2040 plan in terms of doing a full value for money assessment of that proposal. So I think that you know, you make the case, Deputy, of, you know, the need to demand of our EU colleagues you know, certain things to ensure that we reinforce and protect the peace process and so on. I mean, all I can say is that our EU colleagues in this Brexit process to date have been nothing short of extraordinarily supportive. I mean, the solidarity that Ireland has got, so many people predicted that as these negotiations intensified, that Ireland would be cast aside. So I'm not suggesting that you were saying otherwise.
I'm not suggesting that, you know, it's demands. It's practical ways that you know, Europe can help.
So I mean,
you know,
if you look what Europe has done in terms of EU colleagues in the withdrawal agreement, we're now talking about, you know, protecting peace funding, protecting the common travel area, which essentially gives Ireland special treatment, protecting the peace process in full, no diminution of rights, guarantees against future border infrastructure. All of these things require facilitation from other EU countries of a withdrawal agreement that is really about protecting interests on the island of Ireland and a peace process. The focus on Ireland and the attention to detail there, I think, for me anyway, sums up why we're in the European Union. That small countries matter. And when they're threatened or vulnerable, bigger countries and not so big countries in the rest of the Union are supportive and show solidarity. Today it's Ireland, next year it could be Estonia or Latvia or Cyprus or Malta. There are benefits to being in a union. And I think we're seeing an understanding and a solidarity that's very important right now. Not in a way that's in any way anti-British or anti-the UK, but in a way that is looking for a fair outcome. So look, I mean, that conversation will obviously continue from the withdrawal agreement, if we can get it agreed and ratified, into the future relationship negotiation that will, in my view, continue for the next 2 to 4 years. Which is why I think there'll be a need to extend the transition period, should it be triggered and if the withdrawal agreement facilitates that anyway. I don't see how we can get everything done in 2 years, or 21 months. But that'll be a decision for the UK. We've got some big hurdles to overcome before those choices have to be made, though. And certainly between now and the 21st of January, the British Prime Minister has to find a way of getting this deal ratified, and we need to do everything we can to help her, within reason.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. I want to thank you for your detailed presentation at the outset of the meeting, and also for your response to the questions raised by members. Could I say, Taoiseach, I was glad to hear you say that under no circumstances could we countenance the reintroduction of border infrastructure or border infrastructure re-emerging. I live in a community that has been transformed through the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and it has been really transformative. And I think, as said at this committee before, it was only when the Brexit referendum happened that we took stock of the progress that had been made on this island. Under no circumstances can we go back. And I used the phrase previously that the referendum decision, it knocked the stuffing out of border communities. Because those of us who grew up in parishes that were divided along the border, who've had the privilege of representing 2 counties with a long land border with Northern Ireland, we have seen the benefits of the Good Friday Agreement. And as you inferred earlier, there's been a huge growth in North-South trade and the development of the all-Ireland economy through the mechanisms that were put in place and through the political environment that we have had as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. And as you know very well, the food industry and many other sectors of our economy have grown on an all-Ireland basis. Those enterprises and commerce, it grew without people waving flags or people talking political ideology. The political framework and the understanding was there about how to go about creating business and working together. We have businesses now established by people from a different political tradition than I would be from, having business established here. Similarly, people from the south establishing businesses in Northern Ireland as well. That has been really for the benefit, and it's only since June 2016 that we've realised the huge progress that has been made. It's a transformed society, thankfully, even though we fully realise we have progress to make in other respects. Could I just say, I attended recently the launch of a publication by Donal O'Bacon of Dublin City University, a publication entitled From Partition to Brexit. And it was very heartening to listen to the president of DCU at that launch, Professor McCrath, speak about the students in DCU. The overwhelming majority of those today, and in every third level college in our country, they didn't live through the Troubles, thankfully. There's a new generation that did not experience that troubled era on our island. And we surely want to ensure that every protection is made, that we don't go back in any respect, politically, economically, or socially. So I know a huge effort has been put in by the government, supported by all political parties here. And I think bringing representatives and your counterparts in other governments, Taoiseach, to the border area, as we did with parliamentary groups, it gave a good understanding persons in other member states of the European Union that we don't have a border and that communities are living side by side, and that under no circumstances could we countenance a return to the era where we had impediments to the free movement of people, of goods and of services. Just with regard to, Deputy Crowe also referenced the fact, and I was in Belfast and Derry meeting different groups on the Good Friday Committee along with Deputy Crowe, and the need for investment, we all know that. Thomas, you referred to the 2040 national plan, and you mentioned with the North West big development plans for the East Coast as well. And we all welcome those. But there's a central border area that needs particular attention. It doesn't get the attention of 2040 national plan that I would like to see it get. So it's an area I would like to see some attention given to. And there are always competing demands. I'm realistic enough to know that. I know that the British have spoken, and it's a bit of a misnomer, if there ever was one, about a prosperity fund post-2020 for Northern Ireland. We might have, alongside the Peace Programme and the Interreg Programme, maybe we should have developed a particular fund to be administered through ICBAN, the Irish Central Border Area Network that covers Cavan, Fermanagh, Monaghan, Tyrone, and similarly in the North West, Derry, Donegal, and in the East Border region as well. It's one area that we should explore with regard to post-2020, the British, the European Union and our own government contributing to a specific fund. So in that respect, I would like it to be given some consideration, because our area, regardless of what Brexit there is, will be affected adversely, unfortunately. So it's just some ideas for consideration. We have...
Take on board, and feel free to, well, I mean, hopefully people here know they can call me anytime on these things. I mean, we're constantly looking for ways to build bridges between north and south, and obviously building strong, resilient economic development along that middle border region should be a big part of that, because it's, I mean, obviously that was a big focal point for the Troubles in the past. So. Absolutely.
Thank you, Thomas. We have another vote, and I just want to thank you and your officials for your help and cooperation with our committee during the past 12 months, and to wish all of you a happy Christmas. And our meeting is adjourned until this formal committee meeting is adjourned until Thursday, 24th of January, and we've informal committee meetings in the meantime. Thank you.